When a decorated black veteran is violently assaulted by a police officer in broad daylight, the officer assumes that his act of racial injustice will go unnoticed, buried like so many before. But he is gravely mistaken. What he doesn't realize is that the man he put in a coma is the father of someone who holds the power to expose the entire system. This is a story of civil rights, corruption, and an unyielding fight for justice and reform that will shake an entire community to its very foundation. Before we dive into this powerful story, tell us where you're watching from, and if you're driven by a passion for justice and accountability, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories like this one. The late afternoon sun stretched across the small southern town, bathing it in a warm, golden light as Mack Daniels made his way down the familiar streets. At 68, Mack carried himself with quiet dignity, his steps slightly slowed by age, but his posture as straight as ever. A decorated veteran who had served in Vietnam, he was a familiar and respected figure in the community. People knew him as a man of integrity, one who had returned from war only to dedicate his life to uplifting those around him. That day had been peaceful. Mack had spent hours at the local Veterans Hall, surrounded by old friends, their conversations punctuated by laughter and stories of days gone by. The gentle hum of nostalgia filled the air, making it a perfect afternoon. As he walked across the town square, something caught his eye, a gathering crowd near the park benches, his sharp eyes focused on the scene unfolding across the way. Officer Rick Morgan, known for his bullish tactics, loomed over a young man who appeared frozen with fear. The youth, barely in his late teens, was nervously pulling something out of his pocket, hands trembling as if the mere act of compliance was a challenge. Mack's jaw tightened instinctively. He knew Rick's reputation too well. Over the years, whispers had grown louder about Morgan's aggressive behavior, especially with young men of color. Mack's gut churned at the sight, a reflex from years of witnessing moments where power turned into abuse. The small crowd stood in uneasy silence, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Some had phones in their hands, unsure whether to step in or stay back. Mack drew a deep breath and approached, his presence commanding attention. "Everything okay here, officer?" His voice, though calm, carried the weight of experience and authority. Rick's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the veteran. "This is none of your concern, Daniels. Keep walking," he barked, his voice edged with irritation. Mack didn't flinch, his gaze moving to the young man, who looked on the verge of tears. The boy had managed to pull out an ID, which Rick snatched before shoving it into his own pocket, barely acknowledging it. "I'm just checking in," Mack replied evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "Doesn't seem like the boy is causing any trouble." Rick's expression hardened, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. Mack could see the fury in the officer's eyes, a rage that craved a target. The air thickened with tension as the onlookers exchanged uneasy glances. A confrontation was brewing, palpable and imminent. "Step back, Daniels. I'm not going to say it again," Rick warned, stepping toward Mack as if to use his bulk to push him away. But Mack had faced down worse men than him. He stood firm, eyes unwavering. "No need for things to get out of hand," Mack said, his voice soft but resolute. "Let the kid go." The statement, simple as it was, seemed to spark something volatile in Rick. Without warning, his fist shot forward, striking Mack squarely in the face. The impact sent the veteran crashing backward, the concrete rising to meet him with brutal force. His head struck the pavement with a sickening crack, and a shocked gasp rolled through the crowd. Mack's vision blurred as the sky tilted overhead. A warm trickle of blood seeped from the back of his head, pooling beneath him as the world spun out of focus. The crowd, galvanized by the sudden violence, surged forward. Some rushed to Mack's side, while others frantically reached for their phones to record the scene. Rick, momentarily stunned by his own action, stepped back, eyes darting between Mack's prone body and the crowd now gathering with outrage simmering just beneath the surface. His breathing came in sharp, uneven gasps, the reality of what he'd done sinking in like a weight. The moment of stunned silence shattered as a woman shouted, "Call an ambulance." Her voice trembled with urgency. The young man who had been at the center of the confrontation stood frozen, eyes wide with horror, as he watched Mack lying still, the life draining out of the scene as quickly as it had escalated. Bookmark, go back. The park erupted into chaos. A few bystanders rushed to Mack's side, kneeling as they tried to assess his condition. The older man lay motionless, eyes closed, the blood from his head creating a stark crimson contrast against the gray pavement. Whispers of disbelief and shouts of alarm filled the air, blending into an anxious cacophony. Officer Rick Morgan stood a few paces back, his hands still clenched and shaking from the impact. His eyes darted to the crowd, calculating his next move. He knew he had to regain control, fast. With a trembling hand, he reached for his radio, voice uneven as he called for backup. "We have an injured suspect at the town square. Medical assistance needed immediately," he said, the words thinly masking a narrative he was already constructing. The young man, the original target of the confrontation, stared in shock, his hands still up as if unsure whether he was safe to move. The crowd's attention shifted between him and Mack's lifeless form. A few voices rose above the noise, challenging the officer. "That wasn't self-defense, officer," a man shouted, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "We all saw what happened." Rick's face flushed, the accusation landing like a blow. His eyes flickered between the growing number of recording cell phones pointed his way and the fallen veteran. The onlookers' expressions shifted from shock to indignation, their murmurs growing louder and more pointed. "I said back off," Rick barked, desperation seeping into his tone. He knew he was losing control, the authority he wielded slipping like sand through his fingers. But it was too late. The incident had already sparked a fire he couldn't hope to contain. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, their high-pitched cries slicing through the heated atmosphere. The crowd parted reluctantly as an ambulance pulled up, the paramedics leaping out and rushing to Mack's side. One of them, a young man with a focused expression, knelt and checked for a pulse, his eyes narrowing with concern as he felt the thready beat beneath his fingers. "Got a pulse, but it's weak," he muttered to his partner. "Possible severe head trauma. We need to move fast." The paramedics worked quickly, securing Mack's neck and carefully lifting him onto a stretcher. The crowd fell into a hushed silence, their collective breath held as they watched Mack's limp body being wheeled into the ambulance. Just before the doors closed, a voice from the crowd called out, the question hanging heavy in the air, "Is he going to make it?" One of the paramedics paused, meeting the eyes of the bystanders. His response was grim, "I don't know." The ambulance doors slammed shut, and with a jolt, it sped away, sirens blaring as it disappeared down the street. The tension in the square didn't ease. Instead, it seemed to thicken. All eyes turned back to Officer Morgan, who stood rigid, his expression unreadable beneath the simmering fear. "Somebody better report this," a woman said, clutching her phone with shaking hands. "This isn't right." Rick swallowed hard, the weight of a dozen stares pressing down on him. For the first time, he felt the real consequence of his actions. Panic bubbled up, but he pushed it down, his mind spinning with ways to shape the story, to twist the narrative before the truth buried him. But what Rick didn't realize was that the story had already escaped him. Clips of the incident were making their way across social media, their raw footage a damning testament to what had happened. The town's whispers about Officer Morgan's reputation were about to be magnified to a roar. Meanwhile, as the ambulance raced toward the hospital, Mack's fate teetered on the edge. He was more than just an injured man. He was a veteran, a community figure, a symbol, and the community wasn't going to let what happened to him be brushed aside. Bookmark. As the ambulance disappeared into the distance, the reality of what had just happened settled heavily over the town square. The crowd remained, their shock transforming into a simmering anger that was palpable. People exchanged uneasy glances, each one silently processing the violence they had just witnessed. Officer Rick Morgan stood apart from them, a lone figure now facing the scrutiny of a community that had lost its patience. He glanced around, his pulse quickening as he saw more phones pointed at him. Each recording was a potential threat to the narrative he was already crafting in his head. He stepped back, a bead of sweat tracing its way down the side of his face. His radio buzzed to life as a voice crackled, "Back up en route, ETA 2 minutes." But those 2 minutes felt like a lifetime. The crowd, no longer content to merely watch, began to murmur louder, their words blending into a single, rising chorus of outrage. "He didn't even fight back," someone said, their voice strained with emotion. "That was Mack Daniels. He's a good man." "Yeah," another echoed, anger giving them courage. "He's a veteran, and Morgan knocked him out cold for nothing." Rick shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, to justify, to redirect the blame, but a voice called out, louder and clearer than the rest. "We need justice for Mack." The shout ignited a spark in the crowd. The small, hesitant murmurs turned into a wave of demands and accusations. Rick's grip tightened on his belt as he stepped back again, the crowd pressing forward in unified condemnation. Blue and red lights flashed as 2 patrol cars pulled up, sirens wailing. The backup officers jumped out, immediately sizing up the situation. Rick moved quickly to intercept them, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. It got out of control. He intervened, and things escalated. "I had to defend myself," he said, the practiced lie rolling off his tongue. One of the arriving officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair named Lieutenant Harris, squinted at him, eyes flickering with doubt as he took in the scene. Behind them, the crowd had not dispersed. In fact, it had grown, bolstered by others drawn by the commotion and the rapid spread of news. "You need to clear this area," Harris ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. He exchanged a quick look with Rick, one that spoke volumes about the trouble brewing. They both knew the optics were bad, worse than bad. As the officers started to move the crowd back, someone shouted, "We've got this on video. You won't cover this up." Phones were raised higher, capturing the arrival of the additional officers and the defensive posture Rick had taken. Meanwhile, the news of the incident traveled fast. It wasn't just confined to the park or the square. It reached the neighborhoods, the cafes, and the community centers. Before long, clips of the confrontation were shared online, raw footage showing Mack stepping in calmly before being struck and collapsing to the ground. In homes across town, people watched the clips in disbelief. The video told a story that was far from the one Rick Morgan would spin. A story of power abuse, of violence against a man who had fought for his country and earned the respect of his peers. At the hospital, Mack's arrival had thrown the emergency room into a controlled frenzy. Nurses and doctors surrounded him, voices overlapping as they assessed the damage. "Severe cranial trauma," one of the doctors said, glancing at the monitors as they flashed with troubling vitals. "Get him into surgery now." Outside the hospital, a different kind of scene was beginning to unfold. Friends, neighbors, and fellow veterans were gathering, their faces etched with worry and anger. They spoke in low, urgent tones, the disbelief clear in their voices. "He stood up for that kid," one man said, gripping his hat tightly in his hands. "Mack's always been that kind of man." "We can't let this slide," another added, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the small crowd forming. The whispers of police brutality that had always been pushed aside were now being spoken aloud, no longer confined to the shadows. The town, once quiet and complacent, was on the brink of something it hadn't seen in years, a fight for justice. The sun had just begun to set when Elijah Daniels' phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him from the mountain of paperwork that had kept him anchored all afternoon. As the state attorney general, Elijah was no stranger to calls about cases or urgent issues needing his attention. But the number on the screen was unfamiliar, and something in his gut told him this wasn't routine. "Daniels speaking," he said, his voice brisk, professional. The voice on the other end wavered, cracking with emotion. "Mr. Daniels, it's about your father, Mack. He's been hurt. Badly." Elijah's composure faltered, the pen in his hand slipping from his fingers. The words didn't make sense at first, tumbling through his mind in a jumbled rush. His father, Mack Daniels, the man who had always been a towering figure of strength in his life, injured? The disbelief held him still for a moment. "My father?" he asked, the calm of his tone splintering at the edges. "What happened?" "There was an altercation. It involved a police officer. He's in the hospital now, in surgery. They said he's in critical condition." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elijah's feet. An altercation with a police officer? His father, who had faced bullets in battle and walked through life with quiet grace, now lay fighting for that same life in a hospital bed because of someone sworn to serve and protect. The absurdity, the injustice of it all, made his blood run cold. "I'm on my way," Elijah said, his voice hardening with resolve. He ended the call, his hands trembling as he reached for his keys. There was a wariness that came with holding public office, a shield he kept around himself to separate personal feelings from professional duties. But that barrier shattered in an instant. This was personal, more personal than anything he had ever faced. The drive to the hospital felt like a blur. As he neared, the familiar building loomed, its sterile white facade catching the last light of day. But outside, there was nothing familiar about the growing crowd gathered on the lawn. Friends, neighbors, veterans, people he had grown up seeing, and others he didn't recognize, all stood vigil, their faces pale with worry and silent rage. Elijah pushed through the double doors and was met with the rushed mechanical sounds of the emergency room. Nurses in scrubs and doctors with solemn expressions moved with purpose, their hurried footsteps and clipped voices adding to the sense of urgency. A nurse glanced up as he approached, her eyes softening when she recognized who he was. "Mr. Daniels, they're doing everything they can," she said quietly. "Your father is in surgery now. It's serious." Elijah nodded, swallowing hard as he moved to the waiting area. The air was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant, a sharp contrast to the raw emotions twisting inside him. He glanced at the few others sitting in silence, their expressions mirroring his own turmoil. Time crawled. Each second stretched, weighed down by the unknown and the brutal images that replayed in Elijah's mind. He pictured his father lying there, remembered the man who had taught him resilience, who had stood at his side at every graduation, every trial, and every pivotal moment in his life. The idea of that man being struck down felt almost unimaginable, and yet here he was. An hour passed, maybe more, before a doctor emerged, his face drawn and exhausted. Elijah stood abruptly, the room narrowing around him as he met the physician's eyes. "Your father made it through surgery," the doctor began, the weight of his words pressing on every syllable. "But his condition is still critical. We've stabilized him for now, but there's significant trauma. The next 48 hours will be crucial." Elijah's chest tightened, the reprieve barely offering relief. "Can I see him?" he asked, his voice straining to stay steady. The doctor nodded. Briefly. Elijah walked down the sterile hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the room, the sight of his father nearly undid him. Mack lay motionless, a tangle of tubes and wires keeping him connected to the machinery that beeped steadily, almost mockingly. His face, usually full of life, was pale and still. "Hey, Dad," Elijah whispered, a tremor running through his voice. "I'm here, and I'm going to get justice for you, I promise." Word of Mack Daniels' assault spread through the town like wildfire, fueled by grainy videos uploaded to social media and whispers exchanged at neighborhood diners. Within hours, Mack's name was on everyone's lips, accompanied by phrases like injustice and unthinkable. The footage was stark and damning, showing the moment when Officer Rick Morgan's fist met Mack's face, followed by the sickening sound of his fall and the rush of onlookers trying to help. By nightfall, the town square was transformed. What had once been a quiet, sun-dappled space now pulsed with the collective energy of a community rallying for one of its own. Handwritten signs bobbed in the air, some reading "Justice for Mack and no more violence," while voices rose together in determined chants. The tension, long simmering beneath the surface of this town, was now an open flame. Elijah stood at the edge of the crowd, blending in with the neighbors and friends who had known him and his father for decades. He listened as speakers took turns, their words carrying across the cool night air, each sentence a reminder of the pain that had brought them here. Mack Daniels is not just another name. He's a father, a veteran, a friend to many, a local pastor said, his voice rising with conviction. What happened to him is not just a tragedy, it's a symptom of a larger problem. The crowd responded with applause, some nodding with solemn agreement. Elijah's hands tightened into fists at his sides. The grief and anger he felt were mirrored in every face around him, from the young activists who had taken up Mack's cause to the older residents who had witnessed the town's changes over the years. The murmurs of solidarity reached the ears of local news reporters who had arrived, cameras and microphones in tow, capturing every raw moment. This was no longer just a town story, it had become a state story, poised to spread further. And Elijah, standing amidst his community, knew what he had to do. The next morning, while the protests continued outside, Elijah returned to his office. It had been years since he'd felt this level of urgency on a case, but this wasn't just any case. His team, a group of dedicated attorneys and investigators, was already busy at work when he walked in. "Any updates on Morgan?" he asked. Cutting straight to the point. Tasha, one of his most reliable legal advisors, looked up from her laptop. "The officer's been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "But it's not enough. We need more." Elijah nodded, a spark of determination lighting in his eyes. "We're not waiting for them to handle it. We need to start our own investigation now. I want every complaint ever filed against Morgan on my desk by tonight." Tasha's expression hardened with agreement. "We've already begun. And there's more. We found whispers about other incidents. This might not be the first time he's crossed the line." The weight of those words sank in, stoking Elijah's resolve. If this was systemic, if it was more than one man's violent outburst, then their fight was bigger than just justice for Mack. It was about unearthing every hidden misdeed, every failed oversight, and holding those responsible accountable. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, the Daniels family and friends kept vigil. Mack's military buddies, who had shared countless afternoons with him at the Veterans Hall, sat with quiet, stoic expressions. They swapped stories, some with smiles, others with the kind of nostalgia that weighed heavy in the chest. "Remember that time Mack fixed up old Mr. Thompson's porch after the storm?" one veteran said, his voice rough with emotion. The others nodded, each memory layering the gravity of the moment. Mack was more than the man in that hospital bed. He was woven into the fabric of their lives, and they wouldn't stand by while his legacy was reduced to just another statistic. The room was filled with a tense silence, as the rhythmic beeping of the machines reminded them all of how precarious Mack's situation was. Each breath he took was a small battle, and outside those walls, the real war for justice had just begun. Elijah's office buzzed with an intensity that hadn't been felt in years. The atmosphere was electric, fueled by a sense of purpose that gripped everyone inside. It was no longer just a legal matter. It was a battle for accountability, spurred by a deep personal drive and the weight of public expectation. Stacks of files and open laptops cluttered the tables as the team sifted through documents, reports, and eyewitness accounts. The evidence began to tell a story that stretched back further than anyone wanted to admit. A pattern of behavior not just by Officer Rick Morgan, but woven throughout the department. "Here it is," Tasha said, sliding a thick manila folder across Elijah's desk. Her eyes reflected a mix of exhaustion and anger. Records of complaints filed against Morgan over the last decade. Excessive force, racial bias, and intimidation. Most were investigated, but went nowhere. Elijah's jaw clenched as he scanned the pages, each line confirming what he had feared. Some complaints had been neatly buried under procedural jargon, dismissed with phrases like insufficient evidence or resolved internally. The system had protected Morgan time and time again, allowing him to continue unchecked. "How far back does this go?" Elijah asked, his voice tight with anger. "Over 12 years, Tasha replied. "And it's not just Morgan. We're finding similar patterns with other officers. It's systemic." A cold silence filled the room, each person present understanding the enormity of what they were confronting. Elijah's thoughts raced. This wasn't just a case of one rogue cop. It was about an institution that had enabled and concealed misconduct. His father's attack was the catalyst, but it was clear now that this fight was about something far bigger. "We need to go public," Elijah said finally, his voice steady despite the fury coursing beneath it. "The community needs to know what we're up against. And we're not just pressing charges against Morgan, we're launching a full-scale investigation into the department." Tasha nodded, the fire of resolve mirrored in her eyes. "I'll draft the statement. We need to be prepared for pushback, though. They'll circle the wagons." "Let them," Elijah said. "We're not backing down." Outside, The town square continued to hum with the voices of protesters. The initial shock had transformed into organized action. Activists set up tables handing out pamphlets, local leaders gave impassioned speeches, and the signs demanding justice grew more sophisticated and resolute. The footage of Mack's assault played on a loop on people's phones, a rallying cry for those who had felt silenced for too long. Meanwhile, in his dimly lit apartment, Officer Rick Morgan paced. His phone buzzed relentlessly, each new message or notification adding another layer of anxiety. News channels showed scenes of the protests outside the police station, where crowds demanded accountability. His name was plastered across the screen, coupled with words like suspended and under investigation. A knock at the door jolted him from his restless pacing. His lawyer, a stocky man with a perpetual scowl, stood on the threshold. "You're in deep, Rick," the lawyer said without preamble, closing the door behind him. "The Attorney General himself is taking the lead on this case. They've got video and witnesses, and they're digging into your record. It doesn't look good." Rick's hands trembled as he sat down, rubbing them together to try to steady his nerves. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he muttered, the words sounding hollow even to him. "It doesn't matter what you meant," the lawyer snapped, eyes cold. "It's about what happened. The videos don't lie, and neither do the records. We need to figure out how to handle this, or you're looking at more than just suspension. You're looking at prison." Rick fell silent, the realization settling over him like a heavy shroud. The department's history of covering for him wouldn't save him now. And the sight of protesters on the screen, their faces fierce with determination, told him that whatever came next was out of his control. Back at the hospital, Mack's friends and family continued their vigil. His son Elijah knew he couldn't afford to be there as often as he wished, but he made time every night, sitting by his father's side, recounting stories and promises. "Dad, I'm going to make sure they answer for this," he whispered, gripping Mack's hand. The room was filled with the steady hum of machines, each beep a reminder of the fragility of the man who had been a pillar of strength. Elijah stood, his resolve hardening. The fight was just beginning, and he was ready to see it through to the end. Bookmark. The next day, the sun rose over a town that was anything but sleepy. The protests outside the police station had swelled overnight, drawing in people from neighboring areas who had heard about the incident and wanted to stand in solidarity. Reporters set up makeshift stations, broadcasting live as tensions mounted. Placards reading "Justice for Mack" and "Accountability Now" waved in the air, their bold letters reflecting the crowd's collective resolve. Elijah Daniels stood before a podium set up in front of the courthouse. His office had called for a press conference, and the media turnout was significant. Cameras clicked, reporters murmured, and all eyes were on him. He took a moment to scan the crowd, recognizing faces he had known his whole life, friends of his father, community leaders, and young activists who represented the town's future. Each one was counting on him to bring more than just words. "Thank you for being here today," Elijah began, his voice strong but tinged with an emotion that resonated with everyone listening. "We stand at a crossroads, not just as a town, but as a society. What happened to Mack Daniels was not just an isolated incident. It was the result of a pattern of unchecked behavior, protected by silence and shielded by a culture that prioritizes loyalty over justice." The crowd quieted further, the weight of his words sinking in. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in agreement. The air was charged with anticipation. "In the past 24 hours, my team has uncovered a series of complaints filed against Officer Rick Morgan and others in the department," Elijah continued. "These complaints paint a picture of a system that failed its community by protecting those who abused their power. This stops now." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reporters leaned forward, their pens scratching furiously against notepads. The community had suspected corruption, but to hear it confirmed so bluntly by the state attorney general felt like validation and a promise. "We will be filing formal charges against Officer Rick Morgan for the assault on my father, Mack Daniels," Elijah said, the words carrying a finality that hit like a gavel. "But it doesn't end there. I am initiating an independent investigation into the practices of this police department. Any officer who participated in or enabled this culture of impunity will be held accountable. Applause broke out, raw and fervent, mixed with shouts of, "It's about time," and "We're with you, Elijah." The community had been waiting for action, and now it seemed like justice was more than just a distant hope. As Elijah stepped away from the podium, a reporter called out, "Mr. Daniels, can you comment on your father's condition?" Elijah paused, the brief flicker of pain crossing his face before he gathered himself. "My father remains in critical condition," he said, his voice quieter but no less firm. "We remain hopeful." He left the podium as the crowd surged, their energy both supportive and impatient. The battle lines were drawn, and everyone knew that the coming days would be intense. Across town, Officer Rick Morgan sat in the cramped confines of his apartment, the curtains drawn tightly shut. The sound of chants from the protests outside the station reached him even here, each cries a reminder that he was now the villain in a story that would not end well. His phone buzzed relentlessly, news alerts and messages pouring in, each headline more damning than the last. His lawyer's voice echoed in his head, harsh and cold. "They're coming for you, Rick. You need to be ready for what's next." Rick stared at the screen, a breaking news banner streaming across it with the headline, "Attorney General Elijah Daniels announces charges, launches investigation into police department." The words blurred as his vision clouded with panic. The brotherhood he once leaned on felt distant now, as if they had already cast him adrift. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Mack's condition remained unchanged. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors marked the passage of time in slow, agonizing beats. Friends and veterans continued their vigil, their eyes holding stories of resilience and heartbreak. They spoke in low voices, memories of Mack filling the room with the warmth that his presence once radiated. Elijah arrived later that evening, exhausted but resolute. He pulled up a chair beside his father's bed, the noise of the protests outside faint but steady. He took Mack's hand, the familiar roughness of his father's skin grounding him in the storm of his emotions. "Dad, we're making progress," Elijah said, his voice a mixture of pride and sorrow. "People are finally seeing the truth. We're not going to stop until justice is done." Mack's hand was still, unmoving, but Elijah squeezed it tighter, as if willing him to feel the strength of the fight he was leading. Outside, the night deepened, but in that room, hope flickered, a quiet, steady flame refusing to be snuffed out. As the investigation ramped up, the town found itself at the center of an unfolding storm. The local news stations played looped footage of Elijah's speech, interspersed with raw clips of Mack's assault and the growing protests outside the police station. National news outlets started picking up the story, framing it as another example of systemic issues in policing that resonated far beyond the town's borders. Within the police department, tension was thick. Chief Walter Green sat behind his mahogany desk, his face pale and lined with stress. Papers were scattered in front of him, reports, statements, half-hearted defenses. The office that had once symbolized his control now felt suffocating, the walls pressing in as if echoing the collective rage outside. Lieutenant Harris knocked lightly and stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Chief, the Attorney General's team just requested access to our internal files," he said, his voice low. "They're not stopping at Morgan. They're going after everything." Chief Green's hands trembled slightly as he leaned back in his chair. "Damn it," he muttered. He had weathered storms before, kept things buried when necessary, but this was different. The entire department was under a microscope, and Elijah Daniels was known for his relentless pursuit of justice. "You need to be prepared for what happens if this blows up," Harris continued, his tone both cautious and resigned. The chief's gaze hardened. "We've got to find a way to control this," he said, more to himself than to Harris. But deep down, he knew the tide was against him. There was no way to contain this now. The truth was clawing its way out, piece by incriminating piece. Meanwhile, in his office, Elijah and his team were combing through records that had started to arrive. Memos detailing complaints against Morgan were only the tip of the iceberg. They uncovered reports that had been edited or filed away under the guise of internal resolution. Each revelation painted a picture of a culture that not only tolerated but protected bad behavior. Tasha dropped a stack of papers onto Elijah's desk. "Look at this," she said, flipping through highlighted sections. Complaints signed off by Chief Green himself. Multiple instances of excessive force, most of them against Black and Latino residents. They knew. Elijah's jaw set, the muscles in his face tightening as he scanned the documents. It wasn't just about Morgan anymore. This was a system that had failed his father and countless others. The anger that had driven him from the moment he got that call now burned even hotter. "Start drafting the preliminary charges," Elijah said, his voice steady and cold. "Not just against Morgan. I want Green named in this too. He can't hide behind his desk any longer." As the investigation gained momentum, word spread quickly through the town. The protests grew louder, spilling into the night as candles were lit and voices chanted Mack's name alongside demands for justice and reform. The footage of Elijah standing strong at the podium played on repeat, sparking conversations not just about Mack, but about broader issues of police accountability. In the midst of the protests, a young woman named Lena Torres stood holding a megaphone. She was a local activist who had been organizing events for years, but this moment felt different, more urgent. Her voice, clear and passionate, carried through the streets. "We've stayed silent for too long," Lena shouted, her eyes scanning the crowd. "What happened to Mack Daniels could have happened to any of us. It has happened to others, and we were told to move on, to forget. But not this time. This time, we stand together." The crowd responded with a wave of applause and shouted affirmations, their resolve hardening with each word. Across the street, older residents who had known Mack since he returned from Vietnam nodded, their expressions somber but hopeful. Change felt possible, tangible even, in a way it never had before. Back at the police station, Officer Rick Morgan sat in an interrogation room, waiting for what felt like an eternity. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed quietly, matching the beat of his anxious heart. He glanced at the mirrored glass, knowing eyes were on him, analyzing every twitch, every bead of sweat that rolled down his temple. The door opened, and in stepped two investigators from Elijah's office. One of them, a tall, wiry man with sharp eyes, sat across from Rick, sliding a folder onto the table between them. "Officer Morgan?" the investigator began, his tone even but firm. "We're here to talk about more than just what happened in the park. We're here to talk about the last 12 years. Rick swallowed, his throat dry as the weight of his past settled on his shoulders like a shroud. The room closed in around him, and he knew that the reckoning had begun. As investigators delved deeper into the records, more unsettling truths came to light. What had started as a singular case involving Officer Rick Morgan had quickly become a web of accusations implicating multiple officers and leadership figures within the police department. The weight of these revelations wasn't just administrative. It was deeply personal for many who had long suspected they were on the receiving end of injustice, but lacked proof. In his office, Elijah sat surrounded by stacks of papers and glowing computer screens. Each new report seemed to tell the same story. Abuses of power ignored, reports conveniently lost or marked as resolved, with no further action taken. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Chief Green had played a central role in maintaining this toxic status quo. "Listen to this," Tasha said, leaning over her notes. "Here's a memo from 3 years ago. Concerns raised regarding Morgan's conduct with detainees are noted but deemed inconclusive due to lack of substantial evidence. Recommend informal disciplinary conversation." Elijah scoffed, his expression darkening. "And that informal conversation kept him on the streets, doing what he did to my father and others." The legal team exchanged silent, resolute glances. There was a collective understanding that they were about to embark on one of the most challenging cases of their careers. They weren't just targeting an officer or even a chief. They were targeting a system that had rotted from the inside. That evening, Elijah called for a meeting with the local civil rights groups and community leaders who had spearheaded the protests. Lena Torres and other prominent voices were among those who gathered in the courthouse meeting room, their faces a mix of fatigue and unwavering determination. "Thank you all for coming," Elijah began, his voice carrying both authority and empathy. "I want you to know that what we're doing here isn't just about my father. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through this. We're filing charges against Morgan, but we're also going after Chief Green and every officer who played a part in covering up misconduct." A murmur of approval rippled through the room, followed by nods and the occasional clap. Lena leaned forward, eyes locked onto Elijah. "What can we do to help?" she asked. Elijah smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at the show of solidarity. "Keep doing what you're doing. The protests, the pressure, it's working. The more eyes we have on this, the less they can try to push back or sweep it under the rug." Back at the police station, Chief Green felt the walls closing in. Rumors swirled among the officers. The whispers in the hallways spoke of resignations and a department in disarray. Green sat hunched over his desk, a cigar smoldering in an ashtray, the smoke curling into the air like ghostly reminders of choices made and ignored. His phone rang, and the chief reluctantly picked it up. The voice on the other end belonged to the mayor, terse and weary. "Walter, this has gone too far. We're being crushed under the weight of public opinion, and Daniels isn't slowing down. We need to cooperate before this takes us all down." Green's voice faltered. "We still have some cards to play, Mayor. It's not over." "It is over," the mayor cut in, the finality in his voice slicing through any remaining illusion. "They have records with your signature. Step down before they force you out." Green's hand shook as he placed the phone back on its cradle. The veneer of control he'd cultivated over years had finally cracked. He knew that resigning was a small price compared to what was coming, but it still felt like defeat. Across town, Elijah stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie as he prepared for a live interview with a major news outlet. The weight of the fight was heavy on his shoulders, but it was not a burden he bore alone. The community had shown up for his father, and he would show up for them. In the interview room, cameras were readied, and the anchor leaned forward, microphone in hand. "Attorney General Daniels, what message do you want the community and the country to take from your fight for justice?" Elijah took a deep breath, eyes steady and voice clear. "This isn't just about what happened to my father. It's about holding those in power accountable and proving that justice is not reserved for some, it's a right for all. We will not stop until this town and this department face the truth." The camera light blinked red, broadcasting his resolve to homes across the nation. And with that, the fight became not just a local battle, but a symbol of a broader call for justice and reform. The next morning, the town awoke to a headline that sent ripples through every corner. "Police Chief Green resigns amid investigation." The news was a seismic shift, signaling that the wall of silence within the department was beginning to crumble. Reporters gathered outside the station, their cameras pointed at the heavy double doors, waiting for any official statement. Officers moving through the halls kept their heads down, whispers exchanged in corners, eyes darting with unease. Elijah sat in his office, the faint sound of the protests still audible from the square. The resignation was a victory, but it was only the start. Chief Green stepping down didn't erase the years of damage done or the deep-seated mistrust the community felt. Elijah's focus sharpened. There was still work to be done. Tasha entered, holding up her phone. "It's confirmed. Green's issued a statement. He's claiming he's stepping down in the best interest of the department and the town." She scoffed. "He's trying to spin it like he's doing everyone a favor." Elijah's mouth twitched into a humorless smile. "Let him spin. The records speak for themselves." He glanced at the stack of complaints and internal memos on his desk, each one a story of someone who had faced abuse and been ignored. His father's case had brought the truth into the light, but there were countless others waiting for their voices to be heard. In the small, cluttered break room of the station, Officer Rick Morgan sat with his head in his hands. The resignation of Chief Green hit him like a gavel striking down a sentence. If the chief wasn't safe, then neither was he. He thought about the interrogation, the investigators laying out his record, each violation echoing in his mind like a drumbeat of his downfall. He was on borrowed time, and he knew it. Across town, the hospital waiting room remained a gathering point for Mack's friends and family. The tension was palpable, everyone holding their breath for updates that rarely came. The air was heavy with hope and dread, an uncomfortable balance that had become their normal. One of Mack's oldest friends, Harold, leaned over to Elijah's mother, Lorraine. His weathered face showed the toll of sleepless nights, but his eyes were steady. "Mack's a fighter," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "Always has been. He'll come out of this." Lorraine nodded, her eyes red but dry. "I know," she whispered, the words more a prayer than a statement. She reached out and held Harold's hand, drawing strength from his presence. Back at the police station, officers watched with mixed emotions as Chief Green emerged from his office, his uniform crisp but his expression strained. He walked out to the front steps, where reporters jostled for position and microphones were pushed toward him. The crowd of protesters fell into a tense hush, eyes trained on the man who had presided over years of unchecked misconduct. "I have served this community for over 20 years, Green began, his voice measured, each word chosen carefully. "But in light of recent events and the need for transparency, I am stepping down as Chief of Police effective immediately. It is my hope that this will allow the department and the town to heal and move forward." The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and jeers. Some called for more resignations, more accountability, while others felt a sense of progress, however small. Green didn't wait for questions. He turned and walked back inside, the doors closing behind him like the end of a chapter. Lena Torres stood at the edge of the crowd, megaphone in hand. She raised it, her voice ringing out strong and clear. "One resignation doesn't fix the system. This is just the beginning. We need real reform, and we need it now." The crowd echoed her sentiment, the unified chant rolling down the street like a wave. "Reform now! Reform now!" Watching from the courthouse steps, Elijah felt a deep sense of vindication. Green's departure was a victory, yes, but Lena was right. The community needed more than symbolic gestures. They needed structural change, and it was his job to see it through. Inside his office, Elijah picked up the phone and called the lead investigator. "I want a comprehensive report on the department's practices. Every buried complaint, every ignored warning. We're taking this all the way." "Yes, sir," the voice on the other end responded, filled with the same resolve. Elijah put down the phone, glancing at the photo of his father on his desk, Mack in his military uniform, eyes bright with pride and determination. "We're not done, Dad," he murmured. "Not even close." With Chief Green's resignation making headlines, the town found itself at a tipping point. The resignation sent a message that accountability was possible, but it also opened the door to deeper questions about the town's future and the trust between its people and those meant to protect them. The air was charged with tension, each day bringing new voices to the protest, new stories emerging from residents who recounted their experiences with the police. At the courthouse, Elijah sat at a round table with his team. They were reviewing the findings from their investigation so far. The stack of files now represented years of systemic failure. A ledger of suppressed complaints, protected officers, and manipulated reports that pointed directly to the upper echelons of the police department. "We need to push for an external oversight committee," Tasha said, eyes serious as she skimmed through a highlighted report. "If we leave this to the department, it's just going to be another cycle of promises and no real change." Elijah nodded. "Agreed. We can't afford to let them police themselves anymore. But first, we need to lay out every piece of evidence we have so the public can see just how deep this goes." The room fell into a thoughtful silence, each person understanding that the stakes were higher than ever. They weren't just fighting for Mack's justice, they were dismantling an institution that had been built on a foundation of selective accountability. Outside, the protests reached a fever pitch. The community gathered each night, candlelight vigils blending with chants for reform. The local church became a hub for organizing, where volunteers distributed food and water to protesters and provided information on upcoming town meetings and public forums. Lena Torres stood at the front of one such gathering, her voice hoarse but unyielding. "They've taken our stories, our voices, and buried them for years. No more. Mack Daniels is not just a victim, he's a wake-up call for us all." The crowd roared in agreement, fists raised in unity. News outlets picked up her speeches, framing them as the heart of the grassroots movement sweeping through the town. Support poured in from neighboring cities, and soon, busloads of allies arrived to bolster their numbers, bringing with them banners that read, "Justice for all, and end the silence. Within the station, the remaining officers who had once looked to Chief Green for direction now found themselves navigating a sea of uncertainty. Morale was low, and the lines between loyalty and self-preservation blurred. Conversations that had once been whispered were now spoken aloud, officers questioning the future of their careers, the choices they had made, and the actions they had overlooked. Rick Morgan, suspended and confined to his home, watched it all unfold from his living room. Each news report, each video clip showing the crowd chanting his name with disdain, felt like another blow. His lawyer's voice echoed in his head. If you want to mitigate this, you need to cooperate. But cooperation meant admitting guilt, and that thought twisted in his chest like a knife. He had been untouchable for so long, protected by a department that now struggled to protect itself. The realization that he was on his own had never been clearer. At the hospital, Mack's condition remained stable but critical. The steady hum of machines was a backdrop to quiet conversations held in the waiting room. The stream of visitors never stopped. Some came to offer support, others to leave flowers or cards. A group of veterans stood vigil outside, saluting silently whenever a nurse or doctor passed by with an update. Elijah visited each evening, the weight of the case and the community's expectations pressing on him. He sat beside his father's bed, the sterile light casting long shadows across the room. Mack's face, lined with years of wisdom and resilience, was still and pale. "I spoke to the Oversight Committee today, Dad," Elijah whispered, his voice low and steady. "They're interested. We're going to make this happen, not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been failed by the system." He reached out and gently placed a hand on Mack's, the calloused skin a reminder of every lesson, every piece of advice his father had given him over the years. The rhythmic beeping of the machines offered no reply, but Elijah held on to hope. It was what his father would have done. Outside, the city pulsed with determination, no longer content with silence or promises. The fight for justice had become the fight for a new future, and Elijah, with the weight of his father's legacy behind him, was ready to lead it. The days that followed saw the town caught in a whirlwind of developments. Public pressure had forced the town council to convene an emergency meeting, one that was open to residents and live-streamed for those who couldn't attend. The meeting hall was packed, the air heavy with anticipation and impatience. Signs reading, "Justice for Mack" and "No more excuses" were held aloft as people jostled for space. Elijah arrived with his team, taking a seat at the front. The council members sat in a line, their expressions a mix of concern and discomfort. The room buzzed with whispered conversations that halted as the mayor stepped up to the podium. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice strained. "We understand that the community has questions, concerns, and demands for justice. We are here to listen, and we are committed to ensuring accountability." A murmur of skepticism rippled through the crowd. Elijah leaned forward, feeling the tension like an electric current. Lena Torres was among the first to speak during the public comment period, her tone firm and unrelenting. "With all due respect, we don't need more words," she said, her eye came on to the council members. "We need action. We need to see a plan for reform, one that doesn't just promise change but delivers it." Applause broke out, punctuated by calls of agreement. The council shifted uneasily, glancing at their notes as if searching for answers they didn't have. Elijah stood when it was his turn, his presence commanding immediate attention. "This community has been failed, not just by one officer, but by an entire system that allowed abuse to thrive unchecked," Elijah said, his voice clear and resonant. "We've uncovered evidence showing that complaints were ignored, reports were buried, and a culture of silence was maintained under the guise of protecting their own. This stops now." He turned to face the mayor directly. "We need a civilian oversight board, empowered to review police conduct and hold those accountable who have ignored or perpetuated injustice. And we need it now, before more lives are put at risk." The room erupted into cheers and clapping, the energy palpable. The council members exchanged glances, knowing they were cornered. The tide had turned, and they could either ride it or be swept away by it. Back at the police station, officers who had remained silent started to speak up, whispering among themselves in the hallways and behind closed doors. Stories began to circulate, accounts of colleagues stepping over the line and getting away with it, the cover-ups that were carried out to keep the department's reputation intact. Some officers felt the sting of guilt, realizing their silence had played a role in what was now a full-blown crisis. Meanwhile, Rick Morgan sat alone, his world shrinking by the day. He stared at his phone, debating whether to call his lawyer and make a deal. The walls of his apartment felt suffocating, the silence only broken by the distant hum of protests. A knock at the door startled him, and when he opened it, his lawyer stood there, briefcase in hand and a serious expression. "We need to talk," the lawyer said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "The evidence is damning, Rick. We need to consider your options, and cooperation is your best shot." Rick's eyes flitted around the room, unable to rest on any one thing. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all of it was on the line. "Cooperate how?" he asked, voice tight. "Testify against the department, provide insider details," the lawyer said. "Help the investigation into Chief Green's tenure and others involved in the cover-ups. It won't erase what you did, but it might mitigate the outcome." Rick's shoulders sagged. The idea of turning on the department that had protected him for so long was bitter, but the alternative, facing the full force of Elijah Daniels' case alone, was worse. Back at the hospital, a quiet shift occurred. Lorraine and Elijah sat by Mack's side as usual, the machines providing a steady, rhythmic background to their whispered conversations. But tonight, something changed. A slight movement, the flicker of Mack's eyelids, drew their attention. "Did you see that?" Lorraine gasped, leaning closer. Elijah's heart raced as Mack's hand twitched, the small but unmistakable sign of life after weeks of stillness. Hope bloomed, fragile but bright. "Dad," Elijah whispered, his voice cracking, "we're still fighting." Mack's eyelids fluttered again, and though his eyes didn't open, it was enough. It was proof that he was still there, still fighting, and it was the sign Elijah needed to push forward with more determination than ever. The town shifted as news spread that Mack Daniels had shown signs of recovery. It was the boost of hope the community needed, and it only fueled their resolve. More people joined the protests, and the courthouse steps were filled daily with faces determined not to let the momentum slip. Inside, Elijah and his team prepared for the next major move, formal testimonies that would expose the department's inner workings. The announcement that Rick Morgan had agreed to cooperate as part of a plea deal sent shockwaves through the town. People whispered about what he might reveal, who would be implicated, and how deep the corruption went. Elijah's phone rang constantly, with calls from reporters and concerned citizens alike. He ignored most, focusing on the task at hand, bringing the truth to light. On the day of Morgan's testimony, the courtroom was packed. The gallery buzzed with an air of anticipation. Familiar faces, including Mack's friends and local activists like Lena Torres, filled the seats. They were there not just for Mack, but for every person who had suffered under the department's blind eye. Rick Morgan was led in, looking gaunt and visibly shaken. He took a seat at the witness stand, eyes scanning the room before settling on Elijah, who met his gaze without a trace of sympathy. "Officer Morgan," the lead prosecutor began, "you understand that today you are testifying under oath and that any false statement could result in additional charges?" Morgan swallowed, nodding. "Yes." "Let's start with your record," the prosecutor continued. "Over the years, numerous complaints have been filed against you for excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct. Were you ever disciplined for any of these incidents?" Morgan's eyes flickered with guilt. "No," he admitted, the single word cutting through the room like a knife. "Why not?" the prosecutor pressed. Morgan shifted in his seat. "Complaints were often ignored or downplayed. Reports were altered. Chief Green would make it go away, said it was to maintain trust in the force, but really it was to protect our own." A murmur ran through the gallery, people exchanging looks of disbelief mixed with grim validation. This was what they had suspected but had never heard confirmed out loud. Lena's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the armrest as she listened. The prosecutor pushed further. "So the department had a policy of covering up misconduct to protect its officers?" Morgan's hands fidgeted, his knuckles whitening. "Yes, it was unspoken, but everyone knew." Elijah leaned forward, feeling the weight of each admission. His father's assault wasn't an anomaly. It was the result of years of unchecked power. And now, for the first time, those responsible were being forced to confront it publicly. The testimony continued, each answer peeling back another layer of deception. Rick named officers who had been complicit, highlighted incidents that had been hidden, and detailed Green's role in maintaining a culture of silence. The room remained tense, a collective breath held as Morgan laid out the truths that had been buried for so long. After hours of questioning, the prosecutor nodded and turned to the judge. "No further questions at this time, Your Honor." The judge looked at Morgan, who sat slumped, the weight of his admissions pressing down on him. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow," she announced, the gavel striking once, solid and final. As the room emptied, Elijah met Lena's eyes across the crowd. There was no smile, no celebration, just a shared understanding that this was a significant but not final step. Outside the courthouse, protesters awaited updates, their signs held high as reporters relayed the day's testimony. The revelations spread quickly, igniting a broader call for justice across the region. Other towns reached out, inspired to look into their own departments, sparking a movement that rippled beyond the city's borders. Back at the hospital, Mack's small signs of progress continued. His hand twitched more frequently, and a nurse mentioned that his eyelids had fluttered again during the night. Lorraine sat beside him, a mix of hope and exhaustion etched into her features. Elijah joined her later that evening, sitting in silence for a moment before leaning in to speak to his father. "We're getting there, Dad. The truth is out now. People know what happened to you and why. We're making them listen." Though Mack remained unresponsive, Elijah felt a shift, a sense of something larger moving forward, like the turning of a tide. It was enough to keep him going, to fuel the fight for justice that was far from over. The town's streets were alive with newfound energy in the days following Rick Morgan's explosive testimony. For the first time in years, people felt seen and heard, their pain acknowledged rather than dismissed. The police department, now stripped of its chief and under investigation, was scrambling to find footing in the face of mounting evidence and public scrutiny. Officers who had once operated with impunity now kept their heads down, some choosing to resign before more revelations surfaced. Elijah Daniels, exhausted but resolute, pushed ahead. The investigation had unearthed so much more than he'd initially expected, patterns of systemic neglect that reached deep into the department's culture. His office was buzzing with activity, legal advisors finalizing charges not only against Morgan, but also against other complicit officers and administrators who had signed off on altered reports and silenced whistleblowers. "We're ready to move forward with indictments for 3 more officers and 2 administrative staff members," Tasha said, her eyes bright with determination, despite the late hour. Elijah nodded, the lines of fatigue on his face deep but softened by a glimmer of satisfaction. "Let's make sure this is airtight," he said. "They're going to push back with everything they have, but we need to be stronger." The next day, Elijah stood before a podium outside the courthouse, a sea of faces before him. Some held signs, others simply stood with arms crossed, waiting. The press gathered, cameras and microphones pointed, ready to broadcast his words far and wide. "We are filing additional charges against multiple officers and administrative staff for their roles in perpetuating a culture that prioritized self-preservation over justice," Elijah announced, his voice carrying across the square. "This is not just about individual acts, but about a system that allowed these acts to continue unchecked." The crowd broke into applause and shouts of support. Lena Torres, standing near the front, raised her hand in a triumphant fist. The energy in the square was electric, a palpable belief that change was finally coming. Reporters called out questions, their voices blending into a chaotic chorus. One voice rose above the others, catching Elijah's attention. "Mr. Daniels, how does this investigation impact your father's case, and do you believe justice will be served for Mack Daniels?" Elijah's expression tightened, and he took a breath. "My father's recovery is ongoing, but this fight is bigger than one case. Justice for Mack is justice for every person failed by this system. We are making sure that what happened to him doesn't happen to anyone else." Back at the hospital, Mack's progress continued in small, hard-won steps. The movements of his fingers grew more deliberate, and there were moments when his eyes fluttered open, though they did not yet focus. Lorraine sat at his bedside daily, reading the newspaper aloud, recounting the progress of the investigation, the names of those held accountable, and the words of their son that echoed across the town. "You'd be so proud, Mac," she whispered, brushing her fingers over his. "Elijah's doing exactly what you taught him, fighting for what's right." One evening, as Elijah sat by Mac's side, Mac's eyes opened just enough to meet his son's. The recognition was faint, but there was a spark that sent a surge of hope through Elijah's chest. He leaned in, emotion choking his words. "We're getting there, Dad. They're listening now. We're making them listen." Mac's fingers curled slightly around Elijah's, the smallest sign of understanding, and for a moment the weight of the last few weeks lifted. The battle was far from over, but this was a victory, however small, that Elijah would carry with him. The community continued to rally, using the momentum of the case to push for broader reforms. Discussions about policing practices and racial bias entered city council meetings, community panels, and even school curriculums. Lena and other activists worked tirelessly, turning the protests into organized movements for policy change. The police department was placed under temporary state supervision as new protocols were drafted and vetted. Officers found guilty of misconduct were dismissed, and recruitment efforts focused on diversifying the force and instilling a culture of accountability and transparency. The final trial of Rick Morgan began weeks later, drawing attention from across the state. The courtroom was packed, and outside, supporters of the Daniels family and advocates for justice gathered, holding vigil. Elijah sat in the front row, the strength of his resolve mirrored in the faces of those around him. He was there as an attorney general, yes, but also as a son who had fought tooth and nail for justice, not just for his father, but for an entire community. And when the verdict came, guilty on all counts, a wave of relief and pride washed over him. It was a step toward healing, a promise kept, and a message sent. Justice was no longer just a word whispered in frustration, but a reality fought for and won. In the days following the verdict, the town felt the shift from anger and despair to cautious optimism. The conviction of Rick Morgan was a symbolic victory that resonated far beyond the courthouse. For the first time in years, the community believed that change was more than a fleeting promise. It was becoming a tangible force. The story of Mack Daniels, a man whose quiet act of bravery had catalyzed a movement, became a beacon of hope and resilience. Elijah stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. Friends, neighbors, journalists, and strangers who had come to know Mack's name through news stories and protests, all were here to witness this moment. Lena Torres, now a key leader in the fight for reform, stood near the front, her eyes reflecting both satisfaction and determination. Elijah raised his hand for silence, and the murmurs of the crowd faded. "Today we mark a turning point," he said, his voice steady. "The conviction of Officer Morgan and the charges against other members of the department are steps toward a fairer, more just system. But this is just the beginning. We need to keep pushing, to make sure the changes we're seeing now are not temporary, but part of a permanent shift." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Some people embraced, and others wiped tears from their eyes. The work ahead was still daunting, but the community had proven that they were willing to fight for a better future. Inside the hospital, Mack's room was filled with soft sunlight filtering through the blinds. Lorraine sat beside him, her hand on his, a book open on her lap. The rhythmic beep of the monitors had become less ominous as Mack's condition steadily improved. There were now moments when his eyes opened, and though he couldn't yet speak, the flicker of recognition in his gaze was more than enough for Lorraine. Elijah walked in, his tie loosened and exhaustion etched into his features, but his eyes were bright with a rare moment of relief. He leaned down to kiss Lorraine on the forehead and took a seat on the other side of the bed. "Dad," he said softly, "we did it. The first step, anyway. Morgan was convicted. Green and the others are going to face justice too. The town's changing, and it's because of you." Mack's eyelids fluttered, and he shifted slightly. His fingers twitched in response, a silent acknowledgement. Lorraine's eyes filled with tears, the dam of worry and grief breaking into a fragile smile. The door creaked open, and Harold, Mack's old war buddy, stepped inside, his face lighting up when he saw the small signs of progress. "Mack, you old dog, I knew you wouldn't stay down for long," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He placed a hand on Mack's shoulder, squeezing gently. "We've been out there fighting for you, but it's good to see you fighting too." The room grew quiet, each person basking in the rare moment of hope that filled the air. Mack's recovery would be long, and the work in the town was far from over. But this moment was a testament to resilience, both individual and collective. As the days turned into weeks, the community's fight evolved from nightly protests to structured meetings. Committees were formed to oversee the implementation of the Civilian Oversight Board Elijah had proposed. The board's members were a mix of community leaders, legal experts, and even veterans like Harold, ensuring that no voice would be ignored. Lena Torres took on a more prominent role, working with local schools to introduce programs on civic engagement and the importance of understanding rights and responsibilities. The town, once fractured by fear and mistrust, began to knit itself back together, each person playing a part in shaping its future. Elijah continued his work, now leading discussions at the state level to encourage similar reforms in neighboring towns and cities. What had started as a local fight had grown into a broader movement, one that aimed to ensure that Mack's story was not an anomaly, but a catalyst. One evening, Elijah returned to the hospital, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. He entered Mack's room to find his father sitting up slightly, eyes open and clearer than they'd been in weeks. Lorraine was at his side, beaming. Mack's gaze met Elijah's, and though speaking was still difficult, a small, determined smile crossed his face. He raised a hand slowly and touched Elijah's arm. The message was silent but unmistakable. Pride, gratitude, and an unspoken bond that needed no words. Elijah smiled back, tears stinging his eyes. "We're going to keep going, Dad. For you, for everyone. We're not done yet." The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, they walked it with the knowledge that change was possible, not just hoped for. And with each step, the town grew stronger, one act of courage at a time. As the final scene of Mack's journey and the community's fight for justice unfolded, the true impact of their struggle began to resonate beyond the boundaries of the town. The story of Mack Daniels was not just a tale of a man who faced injustice, but a testament to the power of resilience, unity, and relentless pursuit of what is right. It was a reminder that change often starts with a single act of courage and grows through the collective strength of a community. The lessons from this story are profound. It teaches us that justice is not passive, it must be fought for, often in the face of powerful systems designed to resist change. Mack's story highlights the importance of speaking up, even when the odds seem insurmountable. His stand for a young stranger set off a chain reaction that not only brought justice for himself, but also forced a system to confront its failures. Elijah's unwavering commitment serves as a powerful example of how personal conviction can blend with professional duty to create meaningful change. His journey reminds us that fighting for justice is never easy and comes with sacrifices, but it is a battle worth waging. The work of activists like Lena Torres illustrates that change requires both protest and proactive engagement. It needs voices in the streets and at the tables where decisions are made. For the viewers, Mack's resilience and the community's determination serve as a call to action. It's a reminder that no one should be invisible in the eyes of justice, and that collective voices can demand accountability and build a future rooted in fairness. If you found this story powerful, press 1 in the comments. If it resonated deeply with you and inspired you, press 2. And don't hesitate to share your own stories or experiences that reflect the spirit of resilience and justice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Bookmark,